r/pettyrevenge vindictive teacher destroyed my grades, so I exposed him. Mr. Peterson, I think there might be a small error in today's lesson. Those 9 words destroyed my life. I'm staring at the D scrawled across my latest AP history essay, the same type of essay that earned me A's all semester until 3 weeks ago. My hands are literally shaking as I read his comments. Lacks critical thinking. Sources inadequately analyzed. Fails to meet AP standards. This is bullshit. Complete, utter bullshit. 3 weeks ago, I was ranked 3rd in my graduating class with a 3.97 GPA. I had scholarship offers from 2 universities, and my guidance counselor kept calling me a shoo-in for the state academic scholarship program. I was going to be the first person in my family to attend college without drowning in debt. Now, my GPA has dropped to 3.89 and falling fast, all because I dared to correct Mr. Peterson when he claimed the Battle of Gettysburg lasted 5 days instead of 3. I wasn't even rude about it. I raised my hand politely, waited to be called on, and said those 9 words that apparently triggered World War III. When he insisted he was right, I respectfully mentioned that I just finished reading a biography on Lincoln that specifically mentioned the 3-day timeline, and maybe we should double-check. The classroom went dead silent. Peterson's face turned this weird shade of purple, and he stared at me for what felt like an eternity before moving on without acknowledging what I'd said. That night, I looked it up again to make sure I wasn't losing my mind. Nope. July 1st to 3rd, 1863. 3 days. The next day, he announced to the class that he'd verified the information, and the battle was indeed 3 days, but he never once looked in my direction. No acknowledgement. No, thank you for the correction. Nothing. That's when the sabotage started. My next essay, about the causes of World War I, a topic I could write about in my sleep, came back with a C+. The essay was identical in quality to ones that had earned me A's earlier in the semester. Same structure, same depth of analysis, same caliber of sources. But suddenly, according to Peterson, my thesis was unclear and my evidence was superficially presented. I watched him hand back papers to other students. Jake Morrison, who I'd helped with his research just 2 days before, got a B+ on an essay that I literally watched him finish during lunch period. Sarah Chin got an A on a paper that had 3 factual errors that I could spot from 2 seats away. But mine was suddenly garbage. I thought maybe it was a fluke. Maybe I'd had an off day, or maybe the stress of senior year was affecting my work quality. So I spent twice as long on the next assignment. I researched for hours, crafted my arguments carefully, and even had my mom, an English teacher at another school, review it before I turned it in. D+. Insufficient analysis. Poor organization. Does not demonstrate college-level thinking. That's when I knew this was personal. I've always been a good student. Never caused problems, never talked back to teachers, never even had a detention. I respect authority and I genuinely love learning, especially history. Peterson used to praise my contributions to class discussions. He even wrote me a recommendation letter for my scholarship applications just 2 months ago, calling me one of the most intellectually curious students I've had the pleasure to teach. Now he won't even make eye contact with me. But here's the thing about straight-A students, we don't give up easily. And we definitely don't go down without a fight. Peterson wants to play games with my future. Fine. Game on. I decided to document everything. If Peterson wanted to play dirty, I was going to build an airtight case against him. I started keeping a detailed journal of every interaction, every assignment, every grade. I photographed my essays before turning them in and saved all my research materials. I even began timing how long he spent reviewing other students' work versus mine during class discussions. The patterns were impossible to ignore. When Marcus Williams gave a presentation that was clearly pulled from Wikipedia, complete with the same typos I'd seen online, Peterson nodded approvingly and gave him a B+. When I presented my meticulously researched analysis of the Industrial Revolution's impact on labor movements, citing primary sources from 3 different archives, I got a C for failing to demonstrate original thought. But it wasn't just the grades anymore. Peterson started targeting me in other ways. He'd call on me to answer questions, then immediately follow up with, "Are you sure about that?" even when my answers were correct. During group work, he'd hover near my table, listening to our conversations and making pointed comments about students who think they know better than their teachers. Last Tuesday, he assigned us a research project worth 20% of our semester grade. The topic was open-ended, any major event in American history. I chose the Cherokee Trail of Tears, something I'd been fascinated by since visiting a museum exhibit over the summer. I spent my entire weekend at the library and online, gathering sources. I found government documents, personal accounts, historical analyses, everything I needed for what should have been an A+ paper. I was actually excited to write it. Then on Monday, Peterson announced a clarification to the assignment requirements. "I want to make sure everyone understands that this project requires analysis of multiple perspectives," he said, his eyes sliding over me like I wasn't even there. "Simply regurgitating facts from biased sources won't be acceptable. I'm looking for original critical thinking." The message was clear, whatever I submitted wouldn't be good enough. That same day, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. I was leaving Peterson's classroom after the bell when I realized I'd forgotten my calculator. I turned back and heard voices through the partially open door, Peterson talking to Mrs. Rodriguez from the guidance office. Concerns about her attitude lately, Peterson was saying. Very argumentative, disrespectful. I've noticed a significant decline in her work quality as well. My heart stopped. He was talking about me. That's surprising, Mrs. Rodriguez replied. Her other teachers haven't mentioned any issues. Well, AP history is more rigorous than regular classes, Peterson said smoothly. Some students can't handle the pressure. I'd hate to see her struggle in college because we didn't address these behavioral concerns now. Behavioral concerns? I've never been anything but respectful in his class. I've barely spoken up since the Gettysburg incident, terrified of making things worse. But Peterson was building a narrative. Making it look like my grades were dropping because of attitude problems, not his vendetta. If Mrs. Rodriguez put that in my file, it could affect my scholarship applications. Colleges don't just look at grades, they look at character assessments too. I backed away from the door, my hands shaking with rage and fear. This wasn't just about one class anymore. Peterson was systematically destroying my reputation, my GPA, and my future. And he was doing it so subtly that anyone looking at the situation would think I was just a stressed senior whose work was falling apart under pressure. I walked to my car in a daze, my mind racing. How do you fight someone who holds all the power? How do you prove malicious intent when it's hidden behind the authority of grades and professional concerns? That's when I remembered something my dad always said: sometimes you have to fight fire with fire. Time to get creative. The next morning, I walked into AP history with a plan forming in my mind. If Peterson wanted to document fake behavioral issues, I was going to document everything he did. But I needed to be smart about it. I started small. During class, I kept my phone positioned to record audio while taking notes. It felt wrong at first, recording a teacher without permission could get me in serious trouble. But what Peterson was doing to me was worse. The first recording was mostly useless. Normal lesson content, nothing incriminating. But I noticed something interesting when I listened back. Peterson called on me exactly once during the entire 50-minute period, while other students got multiple opportunities to participate. He was systematically silencing me while building his case that I wasn't engaged. By Friday, I had 4 recordings and a disturbing pattern emerged. Peterson consistently dismissed my contributions while praising weaker answers from other students. When I correctly identified the date of the Emancipation Proclamation, he moved on without comment. When Jake incorrectly said it freed all slaves immediately, Peterson said, "Good insight, Jake. You're thinking about the broader implications." But the real breakthrough came the following Monday. I'd submitted my Trail of Tears paper over the weekend, confident despite everything that my research was solid. I'd included perspectives from Cherokee leaders, government officials, and historians from different time periods. It was exactly what he'd asked for. Peterson handed papers back at the end of class. I watched him give Sarah an A, with an encouraging smile. Marcus got a B+ and a nice improvement. My paper landed on my desk without a word, D+. Fails to demonstrate understanding of historical complexity. Relies too heavily on biased sources. Not college-ready work. Biased sources. I'd cited government documents and academic historians. The same types of sources that earned me A's in this class all semester. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely pack my bag. As other students filed out, chattering about their grades, I sat frozen in my seat. This wasn't just unfair anymore, it was destroying me. "Is there something you need, Miss Henderson?" Peterson's voice cut through my panic. I looked up to find him watching me with what I can only describe as satisfaction. Like he was enjoying watching me break down. "I don't understand the grade," I managed to say. "I followed all the requirements." "Perhaps the issue isn't the assignment," he interrupted. "Perhaps you need to examine your approach to this class. Your attitude has been concerning lately." My phone was still recording in my pocket. My attitude? I kept my voice steady despite wanting to scream. "I've been respectful." "Respect means accepting feedback and working to improve," Peterson said, leaning back in his chair. "Not questioning your teacher's expertise or arguing with grades you don't like. Some students think their previous success entitles them to special treatment." There it was. He was admitting this was about the Gettysburg correction, but doing it in a way that made me sound like an entitled brat. "I just want to understand what I need to improve," I said carefully. Peterson's smile was cold. "Focus less on being right and more on being teachable. College professors don't appreciate students who think they know better." The bell for next period rang, and I had no choice but to leave. But walking down the hallway, I realized something important had just happened. Peterson had essentially confessed that my grades were punishment for challenging him. It was subtle, but it was there in the recording. The problem was, it wasn't quite enough. Any administrator listening could interpret his words as legitimate teaching advice. I needed something more concrete. Something undeniable. That's when I decided to take a much bigger risk. If Peterson wanted to play psychological warfare, I was going to give him exactly what he was looking for, and record every second of his response. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. 2 days later, Peterson assigned us an in-class essay about the causes of the Civil War. 30 minutes to write a coherent argument, the kind of assignment that separated the prepared students from the ones who'd been coasting. I knew this topic inside and out. I'd written about it before, discussed it in previous classes, even done additional reading on my own time. This should have been easy points to help offset the damage he'd already done to my grade. But as I started writing, a plan crystallized in my mind. I wrote 2 essays. The first was deliberately mediocre. Not terrible, I wasn't going to tank my grade more than necessary, but clearly B-level work. Surface-level analysis, basic examples, the kind of essay that hit all the minimum requirements without showing any real insight. The second essay was everything I was capable of. Sophisticated thesis, nuanced arguments, specific evidence. The kind of work that had earned me A's before Peterson decided to destroy my life. When time was called, I turned in a mediocre essay. Then I waited. The next day, Peterson handed back our graded essays with his usual theatrical flair. "Overall, I was disappointed with the effort level I saw," he announced to the class. "Many of you seem to think that because this is senior year, you can coast through assignments." My paper landed on my desk, C-. Superficial analysis. Lacks depth. See me about extra credit opportunities. I glanced around at other papers. Jake got a B+. Sarah got an A-. Marcus, who I'd watched stare at his blank paper for 15 minutes before scribbling 2 paragraphs, got a C+. Better than mine. After class, I approached Peterson's desk. My phone was recording, hidden in my jacket pocket. "You mentioned extra credit," I said, holding up my essay. Peterson looked up from his gradebook with that same cold smile. "Ah, yes. I've been meaning to talk to you about your performance lately. I know my grades have been lower than usual." "Lower?" Peterson leaned back in his chair. "Miss Henderson, your work has been consistently subpar for weeks. This essay is a perfect example: shallow thinking, weak arguments. Frankly, I'm concerned about whether you're truly prepared for college-level work. I pulled out my backup essay, the good one I'd written during lunch period. Actually, I was wondering if you could look at this. I rewrote the essay last night because I wasn't satisfied with what I'd turned in. Peterson's eyes narrowed as he took the paper. I watched his face as he read, seeing the exact moment he realized what I'd done. This essay was undeniably better than the one I'd submitted. It demonstrated exactly the kind of critical thinking and analysis he claimed my work lacked. His jaw tightened. This is better. But it doesn't change the grade on the assignment you actually submitted. Of course not, I said carefully. I just wanted to make sure I understood what you were looking for. This essay shows I can do the work, right? The silence stretched between us. Peterson stared at the essay, then at me, clearly calculating something behind his eyes. Understanding the expectations and meeting them under pressure are two different things, he finally said. Anyone can write a decent essay with unlimited time and resources. The in-class assignment tested your ability to perform when it matters. But if I can demonstrate the knowledge and skills. Miss Henderson, Peterson interrupted, his voice taking on an edge I'd never heard before. Let me be very clear about something. I've been teaching AP history for 15 years. I know the difference between a student who's struggling and a student who thinks the rules don't apply to them. My heart was pounding, but I kept my voice steady. I'm not sure what you mean. Peterson leaned forward, his eyes never leaving mine. I think you know exactly what I mean. Ever since your little performance with the Gettysburg dates, you've had an attitude problem. You walk into my classroom thinking you're smarter than everyone else, including me. There it was. The confession I needed, clear and undeniable. But Peterson wasn't done. Students like you are exactly what's wrong with education today, he continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Entitled, argumentative, convinced that Googling something makes you an expert. Well, here's a reality check: I determine your grade in this class. Not Wikipedia, not your opinion, and certainly not your attitude. The threat was crystal clear, and my phone was recording every word. But as I walked out of his classroom, I realized I'd made a critical miscalculation. I'd gotten the evidence I needed, but I'd also painted a target on my back. And Peterson was just getting started. The recording was damning, but I quickly realized having evidence and knowing what to do with it were two completely different things. I spent that entire evening listening to Peterson's confession on repeat, transcribing every word. Students like you are exactly what's wrong with education today. I determine your grade in this class. It was perfect, clear admission that he was grading me based on personal bias rather than academic merit. But who could I tell? And more importantly, would anyone believe me? Peterson wasn't some random substitute teacher. He'd been at our school for 15 years, coached the academic decathlon team to state championships, and had a wall full of Teacher of the Year awards. Meanwhile, I was just a student claiming my teacher was out to get me. Without context, I'd sound like every other teenager who couldn't accept a bad grade. The next morning brought a new nightmare. Peterson had apparently decided that subtlety was no longer necessary. I'm disappointed to announce that several students have been struggling significantly in recent weeks, he told the class, his eyes finding mine immediately. When academic performance drops this dramatically, it often indicates problems beyond the classroom. My face burned as 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me. He wasn't naming names, but everyone knew exactly who he meant. I was the only student whose grades had visibly tanked, he'd made sure of that. I want to remind everyone that maintaining academic integrity in a respectful classroom environment is essential for success, Peterson continued. Students who disrupt the learning process or demonstrate concerning behavioral changes will find their performance evaluated accordingly. It was a masterclass in public humiliation disguised as general announcements. Peterson was poisoning my classmates against me while maintaining plausible deniability. After class, Sarah Chen, who I'd considered a friend, pulled me aside in the hallway. Hey, are you okay? She asked, but her tone was cautious, like she was talking to someone potentially unstable. Peterson seems really concerned about you lately. I'm fine, I said, forcing a smile. Just senioritis, you know. But Sarah's expression told me she wasn't buying it. Maybe you should talk to your counselor or something. It's not like you to let your grades slip this much. This was Peterson's genius. By framing my grade drops as behavioral issues, he turned my academic decline into evidence of personal problems. My friends were starting to see me as the problem, not him. The situation got worse during lunch when I overheard Marcus telling a group of students that Peterson had mentioned concerning changes in some students' attitudes. Marcus was embellishing, turning Peterson's vague comments into dramatic speculation about which student was having a breakdown. I heard Henderson went off on him after class yesterday, Marcus was saying. Like, totally lost it over a grade. That wasn't what happened at all, but the story was already spreading. By the end of the day, half the senior class probably thought I was having some kind of mental health crisis. But the real blow came during 7th period. I was called to the guidance office over the intercom, never a good sign. Mrs. Rodriguez was waiting with a concerned expression and a thick folder that I recognized as my academic file. Please, sit down, she said gently. I wanted to check in about how things are going in your classes. My stomach dropped. Everything's fine, Mrs. Rodriguez. She opened the folder, revealing what looked like incident reports. I've received some concerning information from Mr. Peterson about changes in your classroom behavior and academic performance. What kind of information? Mrs. Rodriguez hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Reports of disruptive behavior, argumentative responses to feedback, and what he describes as increasing hostility toward authority figures. My hands clenched into fists under the desk. Peterson had been filing formal complaints against me, creating an official paper trail to support his narrative. Mrs. Rodriguez, I haven't been disruptive. I've barely spoken in his class for weeks. Sometimes stress manifests in ways we don't realize, she said sympathetically. Senior year is incredibly demanding, especially for high-achieving students like yourself. The pressure to maintain perfect grades can cause some students to lash out when they face academic challenges. She was reciting exactly the story Peterson wanted everyone to believe. Stressed student, declining performance, behavioral issues, a neat package that explained everything while making him look like the concerned teacher trying to help. Has this affected my scholarship applications? I asked, dreading the answer. Mrs. Rodriguez's pause told me everything I needed to know. Some programs do require updated character assessments if concerning behaviors are reported. My future was crumbling in real time, and Peterson's carefully constructed narrative was working perfectly. But as I walked back to class, something shifted inside me. Peterson thought he'd cornered me, thought he'd built an unshakable case against my character. He had no idea what he'd actually done. He'd given me absolutely nothing left to lose. That night, I made a decision that would either save my future or destroy what little I had left. I was going to get Peterson on tape saying something so damning that even his 15 years of sterling reputation couldn't protect him. But I needed to be strategic about it. One perfectly timed recording that captured his true nature in a way no administrator could dismiss or explain away. The opportunity came sooner than I expected, and from the worst possible source. The next day during class, Peterson was discussing the Jim Crow era when Jake Morrison made a comment that made my blood freeze. I mean, it wasn't like they were treating them as bad as slaves, right? At least they had jobs and stuff. The classroom went uncomfortably quiet. Several students shifted in their seats, and I saw Sarah wince. It was exactly the kind of ignorant statement that usually prompted Peterson to launch into educational mode, explaining historical context and helping students understand the reality of systematic oppression. Instead, Peterson nodded thoughtfully. That's an interesting perspective, Jake. The economic opportunities available during that period certainly created different dynamics than slavery. I couldn't stay silent. Not about this. Actually, Mr. Peterson, that's not really accurate, I said, my heart pounding as every head in the classroom turned toward me. Jim Crow laws were specifically designed to maintain economic and social control over black Americans. The jobs available were deliberately limited to keep people in poverty, and Miss Henderson, Peterson interrupted sharply, I don't recall asking for your input. But the statement was factually incorrect. Jim Crow was. That's enough. Peterson's voice cut through the room like a blade. This is exactly what I've been talking about regarding disrupting the learning environment. The classroom was dead silent. Even Jake looked uncomfortable now, seeming to realize his comment had sparked something bigger than he'd intended. I was just correcting misinformation, I said quietly, but Peterson was already writing something in his grade book, probably another behavioral note to add to his growing file against me. Class dismissed, he announced, even though we still had 10 minutes left. Miss Henderson, please remain after. As my classmates filed out, shooting me sympathetic looks mixed with relief that they were escaping whatever was about to happen, I felt my phone recording in my pocket. Whatever Peterson was about to say, I was going to capture every word. The door closed behind the last student, leaving me alone with Peterson for the second time this week. But this time felt different. More dangerous. I've had enough of your disruptions, Peterson said, not even bothering to sit down. You cannot keep undermining my authority in front of other students. I wasn't trying to undermine you. Jake's statement was historically inaccurate and potentially harmful. Harmful? Peterson laughed, but there was no humor in it. You think you get to determine what's harmful? You think your liberal agenda gets to dictate how I teach my class? My breath caught. Liberal agenda? Mr. Peterson, this isn't about politics. It's about historical accuracy. Everything is about politics with students like you, he said, stepping closer to my desk. You people think you can waltz into my classroom and lecture me about sensitivity and correctness. You people. The phrase hung in the air between us like a toxic cloud. I don't understand what you mean by, you people, I said carefully, making sure my phone was positioned to catch every word. Peterson's mask was slipping completely now. Don't play dumb, Henderson. Students from your background always think they know better. Always pushing your perspectives, always making everything about oppression and victimhood. My background? I was a middle-class white girl from suburbia. What background was he talking about? Then it hit me like a freight train. My scholarship application essays. The ones he'd read when writing my recommendation letter 2 months ago. The ones where I'd written about my grandmother's stories of fleeing Nazi Germany, about growing up understanding persecution through family history, about why studying social justice movements mattered to me personally. Peterson wasn't just angry that I'd corrected him. He was angry about who he thought I was. Mr. Peterson, I said slowly, are you saying that my grades have been affected by your personal opinions about my family background? The question hung between us, and I watched Peterson realize he'd revealed too much. His face cycled through anger, calculation, and finally settled on cold fury. Your grades have been affected by your consistently poor performance and disruptive attitude, he said, but his voice lacked conviction now. And if you continue making baseless accusations, I'll have no choice but to escalate this to administration as harassment of a faculty member. It was a threat wrapped in bureaucratic language, but the message was clear, back down or face consequences that would destroy me completely. But I had him now. Everything was on tape. The only question was whether I was brave enough to use it. That night, I stared at my phone for hours, listening to Peterson's voice on repeat. Students from your background always think they know better. You people think you can waltz into my classroom. I had him. This wasn't just grade manipulation anymore. This was discrimination based on his assumptions about my family's religion and background. Any school board in the country would have to act on this kind of recording. But as I lay in bed, my victory felt hollow. Because I'd also heard something else in Peterson's voice during those final moments, desperation. And desperate people do desperate things. The next morning proved my instincts right. I arrived at school to find my locker had been randomly selected for a drug search. Campus security was apologetic but thorough, emptying every textbook and folder while a small crowd gathered to watch. Of course they found nothing, but the damage was done. By first period, rumors were flying about why my locker had been searched. I heard she's been acting really weird lately, I overheard someone whisper. Maybe she's on something. Peterson wasn't in the hallway during the search, but I caught him watching from his classroom doorway with that same cold satisfaction I'd seen before. He'd orchestrated this perfectly, another piece of his narrative that I was a troubled student spiraling out of control. The harassment escalated throughout the day. In third period, I was called to the office because someone had reported me for threatening behavior, a claim so ridiculous that even Mrs. Rodriguez looked skeptical. By lunch, I'd been accused of cheating on a test I hadn't even taken yet and disrupting a class I wasn't enrolled in. Peterson was flooding the system with reports, creating so much noise that my real complaints would get lost in the chaos. Who would believe the word of a student with a disciplinary file this thick? But the final straw came during 7th period. I was sitting in AP Chemistry when Mrs. Williams' expression shifted from confused to concerned as she read something on her computer screen. "Miss Henderson, could you step into the hallway please?" My stomach dropped. Not again. In the hallway, Mrs. Williams, who'd always been kind to me, looked genuinely worried. "I received a message that you've been struggling with some personal issues lately. Are you okay? Do you need to talk to someone?" "What kind of message?" She hesitated. "Mr. Peterson reached out to several of your teachers. He's concerned that you might be having thoughts of hurting yourself." The world tilted sideways. Peterson had just weaponized suicide prevention protocols against me. He'd told my teachers I was potentially suicidal, which would trigger mandatory counseling, parental notification, and possibly even hospitalization if he pushed hard enough. It was brilliant and evil and completely untraceable back to him. He was just a concerned teacher looking out for a troubled student. "Mrs. Williams, I'm not suicidal. I'm not having any thoughts of hurting myself. Mr. Peterson is lying." But even as I said it, I could see the doubt in her eyes. Because what student would admit to suicidal thoughts? And why would a respected teacher make false reports about something so serious? "I have to follow protocol," she said gently. "I'm going to need you to go to the counseling office." As I walked toward what felt like my execution, I realized Peterson had backed me into an impossible corner. I could try to use my recording, but now any accusations I made would be dismissed as the desperate lies of an unstable student who was clearly having a breakdown. He'd turned my evidence into proof of my instability. But Peterson had made one critical mistake in his psychological warfare campaign. He'd forgotten that I was my father's daughter. And my father had taught me that sometimes, when someone tries to bury you, the only way out is to dig straight up and take them down with you. It was time to stop playing defense and go nuclear. The mandatory counseling session was a nightmare designed to look like help. Dr. Martinez, the school's psychologist, sat across from me with that practiced expression of concerned authority that all mental health professionals master. My parents had been called and were driving over. Mrs. Rodriguez was taking notes. And somewhere in the building, Peterson was probably congratulating himself on his masterpiece of manipulation. "Your teachers are worried about you," Dr. Martinez said gently. "Mr. Peterson in particular has noticed some concerning changes in your behavior and academic performance." I wanted to scream. Instead, I sat perfectly still and gave them exactly what they didn't expect: complete cooperation. "I understand their concern," I said calmly. "I have been stressed about my grades lately, especially in AP history. But I'm not in crisis. I'm just frustrated." Dr. Martinez made a note. "Frustration is normal. Can you tell me more about what's been happening in Mr. Peterson's class?" Here was my opening. But I had to be careful. One wrong word and I'd sound paranoid. My grades have dropped significantly over the past 3 weeks, and I'm having trouble understanding why. The quality of my work hasn't changed, but the feedback I'm receiving suggests it has. It's been confusing and stressful. Mrs. Rodriguez leaned forward. "Mr. Peterson mentioned that you've been argumentative and resistant to feedback." I asked questions about my grades because I genuinely didn't understand the criticisms. Maybe that came across as argumentative, but it wasn't intended that way. I was threading a needle here, acknowledging their concerns while subtly suggesting there might be another side to the story. Dar. Martinez was listening carefully, and I could see him processing the disconnect between the panicked, unstable student he'd been expecting and the composed teenager sitting in front of him. "Have you been having any thoughts about harming yourself or others?" he asked directly. "Absolutely not. I've never had thoughts like that. I'm stressed about college applications and maintaining my GPA, but I'm not in any kind of danger." The room went quiet. Dr. Martinez exchanged glances with Mrs. Rodriguez, and I could practically see them recalibrating. A truly suicidal student wouldn't be this coherent about academic stress, and my complete denial was more convincing than deflection would have been. My parents arrived 20 minutes later, and I watched Peterson's careful narrative start to crumble in real time. "We're sorry for the confusion," my mom told Dr. Martinez after hearing the situation. "Our daughter has been stressed about one class in particular, but she's been handling it appropriately. She's never exhibited any concerning behaviors at home." My dad, who Peterson had never met, was more direct. "This seems like a significant overreaction to academic stress. Has anyone actually spoken with our daughter about these alleged behavioral issues, or are we relying solely on one teacher's observations?" Dr. Martinez looked uncomfortable. "Mr. Peterson has submitted several incident reports over the past few weeks." "What kind of incidents?" Dad pressed. The silence that followed was telling. Mrs. Rodriguez shuffled through her papers, clearly realizing that Peterson's reports were long on concern but short on specific, actionable incidents. "Mostly observations about attitude and classroom disruption," she finally admitted. "And the other teachers? Have they reported similar concerns?" Another pause. "Not specifically." I watched my parents exchange a look that any teenager would recognize, the look of adults realizing something wasn't adding up. "We'd like to request copies of these incident reports," Mom said in her teacher voice, polite but absolutely non-negotiable. "And we'd like to schedule a meeting with Mr. Peterson and the administration to discuss our daughter's academic performance." Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. "Of course. That seems reasonable." As we left the counseling office, I realized Peterson's nuclear option had backfired spectacularly. Instead of discrediting me, he'd drawn my parents directly into the situation and raised red flags about his own behavior. But I also knew this meant war was officially declared. And Peterson still had no idea what was coming for him. That evening, my parents and I sat around our kitchen table planning what felt like a military operation. Dad had his laptop open, taking notes in the same methodical way he approached his engineering projects. Mom was grading papers with one hand and scrolling through the school district's policies with the other. So let me get this straight, Dad said, adjusting his glasses. Your grades dropped dramatically after you corrected a factual error. This teacher has been filing behavioral reports that no other faculty member corroborates, and today he essentially triggered a mental health crisis response over academic stress. That's exactly what happened. Mom looked up from her papers. Honey, I've been teaching for 12 years. What you're describing isn't normal classroom management. This feels personal. I took a deep breath. I think I have proof of that. For the next hour, I walked them through everything, the systematic grade sabotage, the humiliating classroom comments, the incident reports. I showed them my carefully documented evidence, photos of my essays, detailed notes about classroom interactions, the stark contrast between my recent grades and previous work. But I held back the recordings. I wasn't sure if they were legally admissible, and I wanted to see how far we could get with the obvious evidence first. This is a pattern of harassment, Dad said finally. We're not just dealing with a grading dispute anymore. The next morning brought our first victory. Mrs. Rodriguez had scheduled the requested meeting for Friday afternoon, and she'd mentioned that the principal, Dr. Webb, would be attending personally. Peterson couldn't dismiss this as an overreacting student anymore. Now he had to face parents and administration together. But victory felt premature when I walked into AP history and saw Peterson's expression. If I thought he looked satisfied before, now he looked absolutely predatory. Good morning, class, he said, his eyes finding mine immediately. I hope everyone completed last night's reading assignment, because we're having a pop quiz. My stomach dropped. There had been no reading assignment mentioned yesterday. I glanced around the room and saw the same confusion on other students' faces. I announced this yesterday after Miss Henderson's disruption, Peterson continued smoothly. Perhaps those who were paying attention to drama instead of instruction should have been taking notes. It was a lie. A blatant, obvious lie. But it was also brilliant. He was creating a situation where I'd fail a quiz that other students somehow knew about, making it look like my academic problems were escalating. Mr. Peterson, Sarah raised her hand hesitantly. I don't remember you mentioning a reading assignment. Really? Peterson's eyebrows rose in theatrical surprise. Perhaps you should compare notes with students who were paying closer attention. He handed out quiz papers, and my blood ran cold when I saw the questions. They were about material from a textbook chapter we hadn't covered yet, content that would be impossible to answer without prior knowledge. But as I looked around the room, I realized other students were writing confidently. Somehow, they actually did know about this assignment. That's when I saw Jake slip his phone under his desk and start typing answers while looking at the screen. Other students were doing the same thing. They were looking up answers in real time while Peterson pretended not to notice. Everyone except me. Eyes on your own paper, Miss Henderson, Peterson called out, even though I hadn't been looking anywhere but at my own quiz. Academic integrity is crucial for college preparation. The irony was suffocating. He was lecturing me about integrity while actively enabling cheating for everyone else in the room. I answered what I could from general knowledge and educated guessing, but I knew I was going to fail. Peterson had engineered a perfect trap, a failed quiz just days before our parent meeting that would make my claims of persecution look like academic desperation. But as I handed in my paper, I realized Peterson had made a critical error in his psychological warfare. He'd gotten so focused on destroying me that he'd forgotten other people were watching. And some of them were starting to notice that something was very, very wrong. The quiz results came back the next day, and Peterson's theatrical presentation was worthy of an Oscar. I'm disappointed to report that several students clearly didn't prepare adequately, he announced, making a show of looking through the papers. However, I'm pleased that most of you took the assignment seriously. He walked around the room, handing back papers with his usual commentary. Sarah got an A, with an encouraging nod. Marcus received a B+ and a good work. Jake, who I'd watched cheating for the entire quiz, earned an A with excellent preparation. My paper landed on my desk with a resounding thud. F, see me after class, Peterson said quietly, but loud enough for nearby students to hear. I stared at the red F bleeding across the top of my quiz, and something inside me finally snapped. Not into anger or tears, into cold, calculating fury. Peterson thought he was playing chess while I was playing checkers. Time to show him how wrong he was. Mr. Peterson, I said, raising my hand. I have a question about the quiz material. His eyes narrowed slightly, sensing a trap but unable to refuse without looking unreasonable. Yes. The questions cover Chapter 18 of the textbook, which discusses post-Reconstruction economic policies. But according to our syllabus, we're not scheduled to cover that material until next month. The classroom went quiet. I watched several students glance down at their papers, then at each other, clearly realizing something was off. Advanced students should be reading ahead, Peterson replied smoothly. I expect AP students to take initiative in their learning. Of course, I said, keeping my voice perfectly respectful. I'm just curious how other students knew to prepare for this specific chapter. Sarah, did you happen to read ahead to Chapter 18? Sarah looked uncomfortable. That's enough, Peterson interrupted sharply. This is exactly the kind of disruptive behavior I've been documenting. Class, please take out your homework from last night. But the damage was done. Students were whispering, comparing papers, starting to piece together that something wasn't right about this quiz. I caught Sarah's eye and saw confusion mixed with growing suspicion. After class, Peterson's mask dropped completely. You think you're clever, he said as I approached his desk. But all you've done is prove my point about your behavior to a room full of witnesses. I just asked a question about the material. You tried to embarrass me in front of the class by implying I gave an unfair quiz. That's manipulative and inappropriate. I pulled out my phone, making sure the recording app was running. Mr. Peterson, are you saying that asking about curriculum timing is inappropriate? I'm saying that your pattern of argumentative behavior is becoming impossible to ignore. First the Gettysburg incident, then your outburst about Jim Crow, now this disruption. You're clearly struggling to handle academic challenges appropriately. What if I could prove that other students had advance notice about this quiz? Peterson's face went very still. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything. I'm asking a direct question. Did you give certain students information about this quiz that wasn't provided to the entire class? That's a serious accusation, Miss Henderson. Are you claiming I show favoritism? I'm asking for clarification about how students were supposed to prepare for material we haven't covered yet. The silence stretched between us, and I could see Peterson calculating his response. He was trapped between admitting he'd given some students advance notice or acknowledging that the quiz was unfair. Perhaps, he said finally, if you spent less time looking for excuses and more time taking responsibility for your academic preparation, your performance would improve. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't an explanation. It was deflection, and we both knew it. I'll be sure to mention this conversation at Friday's meeting with my parents and Dr. Webb, I said quietly. Peterson's expression shifted into something I'd never seen before, genuine alarm mixed with cold rage. Miss Henderson, I'd be very careful about making accusations you can't support. False statements about faculty members can have serious consequences for students. The threat hung in the air between us, but for the first time in weeks, I wasn't afraid. Because Peterson had just made his biggest mistake yet. He'd threatened me on tape. That threat was the final puzzle piece I needed, but it also meant I was now in genuine danger. Walking out of Peterson's classroom, I felt like I was carrying a live grenade. The recording on my phone contained everything, his admission of grading bias, the discriminatory comments, and now an explicit threat against a student for reporting misconduct. Any reasonable administrator would have to act on evidence this clear. But Peterson wasn't going to go down quietly. And cornered animals are the most dangerous. I made it exactly 3 periods before his retaliation began. During lunch, Mrs. Rodriguez's voice crackled over the intercom, Miss Henderson, please report to the main office immediately. The cafeteria went dead silent. Being called to the office during lunch was never good, but there was something about the formal tone that made other students look up from their food. I caught Sarah's worried expression as I gathered my things. Bring your belongings, Mrs. Rodriguez added, which made my blood run cold. In the hallway, I passed Mr. Chen, the custodian, wheeling a cart toward the main office. On top sat my backpack, the same backpack I'd left in my locker during lunch. They'd searched my locker again. But this time, they'd found something. Dr. Webb was waiting in his office with Mrs. Rodriguez, my backpack open on his desk, and a small plastic bag containing what looked like prescription pills. My hands went numb as I stared at the evidence that had definitely not been in my possession that morning. Sit down, please, Dr. Webb said gravely. We need to discuss these Adderall tablets we found in your locker. Those aren't mine, I said immediately. Dr. Webb nodded like he'd expected that response. The pills aren't prescribed to you. I don't take Adderall. I've never taken Adderall. Someone put those in my locker. Mrs. Rodriguez leaned forward sympathetically. I know this is frightening, but we've had concerns about your stress levels lately. Some students turn to unprescribed medications when they feel overwhelmed. I realized with growing horror that Peterson had perfectly set up this moment. Weeks of documented behavioral concerns, the mental health crisis he'd manufactured yesterday, my parents' meeting scheduled for Friday, it all led to this narrative of a student spiraling out of control and turning to drugs. Mrs. Rodriguez, I swear on my grandmother's grave, those pills are not mine. Someone planted them. Who would do something like that? Dr. Webb asked. The question hung in the air like a trap. If I accused Peterson without ironclad proof, I'd sound paranoid and desperate. But if I didn't defend myself, I'd be accepting responsibility for drug possession at school. I don't know, I said carefully. But I know they're not mine. Dr. Webb opened a file on his desk. Unfortunately, we have to take any drug possession seriously. Combined with the recent behavioral reports and academic struggles. What are the consequences? Mandatory drug testing, suspension pending investigation, and depending on the results, possible expulsion with criminal charges. The room spun around me. Expulsion meant no graduation, no college, no scholarships. Everything I'd worked for since kindergarten, destroyed by a bag of pills I'd never seen before. I want to call my parents, I said. Of course. They're already on their way. While we waited, I sat in the office trying to process the sophistication of Peterson's frame job. The timing was perfect, close enough to Friday's meeting to derail it, but with enough lead time to build additional documentation. The drug choice was smart too, Adderall was common enough that possession seemed plausible, but serious enough to justify severe consequences. But Peterson had made one critical miscalculation. He'd forgotten that I'd been documenting everything for weeks, and my behavior patterns were already established. When my parents arrived and saw the evidence, their reaction wasn't disappointment or shock. It was immediate, blazing fury. Absolutely not, my mother said after hearing the accusations. Our daughter has never used unprescribed medication. She won't even take Tylenol without asking permission first. Dad was already on his phone with our family lawyer, his engineering mind shifting into problem-solving mode. We want those pills fingerprinted, he told Dr. Webb. We want security footage of everyone who accessed her locker. And we want to know exactly who reported this discovery. Dr. Webb looked uncomfortable. Mr. Henderson, I understand you want to support your daughter, but we have to follow protocol. Your protocol, Dad interrupted, just accused an honor student with no disciplinary history of drug possession. So we're going to follow our protocol too, which involves lawyers and evidence. That's when I realized Peterson had overplayed his hand. The recording on my phone was about to become the least of his problems. The drug test results came back clean, exactly as my parents knew they would. But Peterson's real genius wasn't in the pills themselves, it was in the chaos they created. While we were dealing with lawyers and evidence protocols, Peterson had been busy rewriting history. By the time I returned to school on Wednesday, the narrative had shifted completely. I heard Henderson got caught with drugs, I overheard Marcus telling a group of sophomores. That's why she's been acting so crazy in Peterson's class. The rumor mill had transformed my 3-day suspension into confirmation of guilt, regardless of the actual test results. Students who barely knew me were nodding knowingly, as if drug possession explained everything about my supposed behavioral problems. But the real masterstroke came during my first day back. Welcome back, Miss Henderson, Peterson announced as I walked into AP History, his voice dripping with false concern. I hope you're getting the help you need. 20 pairs of eyes turned toward me, and I could practically hear their thoughts. Help for what? Peterson had managed to reference my suspension without actually saying anything actionable, leaving everyone to draw their own conclusions. Thank you, Mr. Peterson, I replied evenly, taking my seat while my phone began recording automatically. I'm ready to focus on academics. Excellent. Since you missed Monday's quiz, you'll need to make that up after class today. My stomach dropped. Another impossible quiz, no doubt, designed to add one more failing grade to my record before Friday's meeting. But as Peterson began the day's lesson about the progressive era, I noticed something different in the classroom dynamic. Sarah kept glancing at me with obvious concern. Even Jake looked uncomfortable when Peterson made pointed comments about maintaining focus despite personal distractions. The shift became clear during group work when Sarah leaned over to whisper, the quiz on Monday was really weird. Peterson said you disrupted class when he announced it, but honestly, I don't remember him mentioning any assignment either. My heart jumped. What do you mean? I think something fishy is going on. Marcus told me he got a text from Peterson Sunday night with the reading assignment, but I never got one. Did you? I shook my head, afraid to say too much but desperate to hear more. Yeah, that's what I thought. And then during the quiz, Peterson kept walking around but only stopped to help certain students. It was like he wanted some of us to fail. Before I could respond, Peterson's voice cut across the room. Miss Henderson, Miss Chen, I hope you're discussing the assignment and not personal matters. We're working on the progressive era questions, Sarah replied smoothly, but I caught the slight edge in her voice. After class, Sarah lingered as other students filed out. Hey, she said quietly, can I ask you something? Do you really think Peterson has been treating you unfairly? It was the first time anyone had directly acknowledged what I'd been experiencing. Why do you ask? Because I've been paying attention since Monday, and some things don't add up. The quiz thing, the way he talks to you versus everyone else, even today when he made that comment about getting help. She paused, looking around to make sure we were alone. I don't think you're the problem here. The validation was overwhelming, but I forced myself to stay cautious. I've just been trying to do my work and keep my head down. Yeah, well, maybe that's part of the problem. Maybe someone needs to speak up. Before I could ask what she meant, Peterson appeared in the doorway. Miss Henderson. Ready for that makeup quiz? Sarah shot me a meaningful look before gathering her things. Good luck, she said, and something in her tone suggested she meant more than just the test. As I sat down for another rigged assessment, I realized Peterson's campaign of psychological warfare had created an unintended consequence. Other students were finally paying attention. And they were starting to see cracks in his perfect facade. The makeup quiz was exactly what I'd expected, questions about material we hadn't covered, designed to generate another failing grade for Peterson's collection. But as I struggled through impossible questions about economic policies from chapters we wouldn't reach for weeks, I noticed something that made my pulse quicken. Peterson kept checking his phone. Every few minutes, he'd glance at the screen with increasing agitation, his calm demeanor starting to crack around the edges. Take your time, Miss Henderson, he said, but his voice carried a tension that hadn't been there at the start of class. Though I do have another appointment soon. I dragged out the quiz as long as possible, pretending to consider answers I knew I couldn't provide. 20 minutes in, Peterson's phone buzzed again, and this time his reaction was unmistakable, his jaw tightened and his knuckles went white as he gripped the device. Are you nearly finished? He asked, abandoning any pretense of patience. Just reviewing my answers, I said, buying more time while my own phone recorded everything from my backpack. That's when Dr. Webb's voice came over the classroom intercom. Mr. Peterson, please report to the main office at your earliest convenience. Peterson's face went ashen. Miss Henderson, please finish up quickly and leave your quiz on my desk. I need to step out. The moment he left the room, I abandoned the impossible quiz and pulled out my phone. Whatever was happening in the main office, it was clearly connected to those increasingly frantic text messages Peterson had been receiving. I was gathering my things when Sarah appeared in the doorway. Is Peterson gone? She whispered, looking around nervously. He got called to the office. What are you doing here? Sarah stepped into the classroom and closed the door behind her. I need to tell you something, and I don't have much time. Yesterday after school, I went to Peterson's room to ask about the quiz material, and I overheard him on the phone. My heart started pounding. What kind of phone call? He was talking to someone about you. He said something like, the situation is getting out of hand and we need to accelerate the timeline. Then he mentioned Friday's meeting with your parents and said he needed to establish a more comprehensive pattern of instability. The room felt like it was spinning. Peterson wasn't just targeting me randomly, he was coordinating with someone else, planning his attacks systematically. Sarah, did you tell anyone about this? I tried to figure out what to do all night. This morning I finally went to my mom, and she called the school. She used to be a lawyer before she became a teacher, and she said what I heard sounded like conspiracy to harm a student's academic standing. That explained the urgent text messages and the sudden call to the office. Sarah's mother had just blown up Peterson's entire operation. There's more, Sarah continued, glancing nervously at the door. I talked to 3 other students who got those Sunday night texts about the quiz material. We compared the messages, and they all came from Peterson's personal phone number, not the official school system. He was secretly giving certain students advance notice while setting you up to fail. My hands were shaking as the implications sank in. Sarah, that's evidence of deliberate academic sabotage. I know. And I saved all the text messages. She pulled out her phone, showing me screenshots of Peterson's messages with timestamps and phone numbers. My mom says this could get him fired. Before I could respond, we heard footsteps in the hallway. Sarah quickly put her phone away and grabbed a textbook from Peterson's shelf, pretending to look something up. Peterson walked back into the classroom, and one look at his face told me everything I needed to know. His careful mask of professional concern was completely gone, replaced by barely contained panic and rage. Miss Chen, what are you doing in my classroom? I was looking up information for tonight's homework, Sarah said calmly, but I could see her hands trembling slightly. Peterson's eyes moved between us, clearly calculating what we might have discussed in his absence. Both of you need to leave. Now. As we walked out together, Sarah whispered under her breath, check your email tonight. My mom is sending you something important. Peterson's perfect frame job was falling apart, and tomorrow's meeting with my parents was about to become his worst nightmare. That evening, I sat in my bedroom refreshing my email every 30 seconds, waiting for Sarah's mom's message. When it finally arrived at 8:47 p.m., the subject line made my heart skip: documentation of academic misconduct, urgent. The email contained everything. Screenshots of Peterson's secret text messages to select students. A detailed timeline Sarah had constructed showing the pattern of my grade drops. Even a recording Sarah had made on her phone of Peterson's suspicious conversation about accelerating the timeline. But the real bombshell was in the final attachment: security footage. I have a contact in the district IT department, Mrs. Chen had written. This shows locker access logs for the day the pills were discovered. Notice the timestamp. I opened the video file with trembling fingers. The black and white footage showed the hallway outside my locker during lunch period. At 12:23 p.m., a figure approached my locker, fumbled with something at the lock, opened it briefly, and walked away. The person was wearing a hoodie, face partially obscured, but the body language was unmistakable. I'd watched Peterson move around his classroom every day for months. He'd planted the pills himself. Holy shit, I whispered, then immediately covered my mouth even though I was alone. But there was no other response adequate for watching a teacher commit a felony on camera. My phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Did you see it? My mom says we have enough to destroy him. She's already contacted the district superintendent. I was typing a response when my phone rang. Unknown number. Hello. Miss Henderson. Peterson's voice was calm, but there was something underneath it that made my skin crawl. I think we need to have a conversation before tomorrow's meeting. Every instinct screamed at me to hang up, but I forced myself to stay on the line. What kind of conversation? The kind where we discuss what's best for your academic future. I understand there have been some misunderstandings about recent events. Misunderstandings. Sometimes situations escalate beyond what anyone intended. But I'm prepared to recommend a clean slate for your grades if we can resolve this matter privately. He was trying to make a deal. Offering to restore my grades in exchange for my silence about everything he'd done. The casual way he said it made it clear he'd done this before. Mr. Peterson, are you suggesting I drop my complaints about your grading practices? I'm suggesting that ambitious students sometimes need guidance about which battles are worth fighting. Your college future is too important to sacrifice over personality conflicts. The threat was crystal clear: take the deal or face consequences that would follow me beyond high school. I need to think about it, I said, playing for time while my phone automatically recorded the conversation. Of course. But Miss Henderson. I'd think carefully. Some accusations, once made publicly, can't be taken back. And sometimes they reflect more poorly on the accuser than the accused. The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in the dark. Peterson was offering me an exit ramp, my grades restored, my college prospects intact, everything back to normal. All I had to do was stay quiet about systematic academic fraud, planted evidence, and deliberate psychological manipulation. 6 weeks ago, I might have taken it. The scared, people-pleasing student who just wanted good grades and teacher approval would have grabbed that lifeline. But that student was gone, destroyed by Peterson's own campaign of harassment. The person sitting in this bedroom, surrounded by evidence of institutional corruption, wasn't interested in quiet exits anymore. Peterson had given me one final choice: stay silent and complicit, or burn his entire world down. I opened my laptop and began typing an email to the local newspaper's education reporter. Some battles were worth everything. The meeting was scheduled for 3:30 p.m. on Friday. By 3:15, Peterson's career was already over. I sat in Dr. Webb's office, surrounded by an army I'd never expected: my parents, Sarah and her lawyer mother, Mrs. Chen with her IT contacts, and 2 representatives from the district superintendent's office who'd arrived that morning after Mrs. Chen's midnight phone calls. Peterson walked in right on time, clearly expecting to face down one angry family and a few administrators he'd manipulated for years. Instead, he found a room full of evidence and witnesses that made his face go chalk white. Please, sit down, Mr. Peterson, said Ms. Martinez from the district office. We have several items to discuss. Dr. Webb looked like he'd aged 10 years since yesterday. We've received some serious allegations about academic misconduct and harassment of students. Peterson maintained his composure, settling into teacher mode. I'm always willing to discuss student concerns, though I should note that Miss Henderson has been struggling with behavioral issues lately. Let's start with these, Mrs. Chen interrupted, sliding printed screenshots across the table. Text messages from your personal phone to select students, providing advance notice of quiz material that wasn't shared with the entire class. Peterson's mask cracked slightly. I sometimes provide additional guidance to students who show initiative. And this, Ms. Martinez added, opening her laptop to show the security footage. Time-stamped video of someone accessing Miss Henderson's locker without authorization on the day contraband was discovered. The room went dead silent as we watched Peterson plant the pills in my locker. His face cycled through denial, calculation, and finally defeat as he realized the figure on screen was unmistakably him. There's also this, I said quietly, pulling out my phone. A recording from yesterday evening. Peterson's voice filled the room. I'm prepared to recommend a clean slate for your grades if we can resolve this matter privately. Some accusations, once made publicly, can't be taken back. Dr. Webb leaned back in his chair like he'd been physically struck. 15 years of Peterson's sterling reputation evaporated in 30 seconds of audio. Jesus Christ, Robert, he whispered. What have you done? Peterson's lawyer-crafted composure finally shattered completely. She was disrupting my classroom. Undermining my authority. Students like her think they can waltz in Anne. Students like her. Ms. Martinez's voice was deadly quiet. What exactly do you mean by that, Mr. Peterson? I watched Peterson realize he was about to repeat the same discriminatory language that was already captured on my recordings. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. I think, said Mrs. Chen in her former prosecutor voice, Mr. Peterson has said quite enough. The rest happened with bureaucratic efficiency that was almost anticlimactic. Peterson was immediately suspended pending investigation. My grades were restored to their pre-October levels based on a clear pattern of sabotage. The principal promised a full review of Peterson's other classes to identify additional victims. But the moment that made everything worthwhile came as Peterson gathered his things to leave. You have no idea what you've done, he hissed at me as district security waited to escort him out. You think this makes you special? You think anyone will care about this next year? I looked him straight in the eyes, the same eyes that had terrorized me for weeks, and smiled. Mr. Peterson, I don't need to be special. I just needed to be right. His face crumpled as the full weight of his situation hit him. Criminal charges for planting drugs. Civil liability for harassment. The end of his teaching career and pension. All because he couldn't handle being corrected by a 17-year-old girl. 6 months later, I graduated valedictorian. My acceptance speech mentioned the importance of standing up for truth, even when it's difficult. Peterson was arrested 3 weeks after that for similar incidents at his previous school. Turns out I wasn't his first victim. Just his last.